Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and today we have an exciting first look at the Tormented Mythic Plus Affix, which is the name of it. And it is next season's M Plus Affix, and it has gone up on the PTR for testing today. And we have quite a bit of information about how it works already, and it's pretty much fully functional for testing there. There are some unanswered questions, but a lot has been learned, and in this video we're going to take a look at this Wowhead article, which has most of that information. And I have a little bit more information that various friends have told me about how it functions on the PTR that I will relay to you as well. And I'll try and provide some analysis about my thoughts on what sort of implications this might have, both for the metagame and just for how the best way to play against this affix is going to be. So let's get started. Here's a short summary of the new affix. 4 new lieutenants are available to kill in the dungeon. That might sound pretty familiar. That is exactly the same data point that you could put next to the Awakened affix. When you kill a lieutenant, you get an Anima Power. So, sort of like Awakened, you get something good for killing a lieutenant. Unlike Awakened, the good thing you get is a Anima Power, which increases your character's power, and not a skip through the dungeon, which is what Awakened gave you. Anima Powers do not appear to be RNG, and are role-specific, and we'll go more into exactly what this means later. This is still one of the things that's a little bit of a question mark, but it does appear pretty much at this point that for any given run, you will be able to know in advance, if you want to, what all of the Anima Power offerings will be for you in that run, and it won't be a case, which I think was a common fear among a lot of players before this affix was testable, that you would just be... You'd have this experience of, like, there are some good Anima Powers and some bad ones, and whether or not I time my key will depend on whether I get the good ones or the bad ones. Which, because if you've done Torghast, right, that's something that certainly I'm sure resonates with you. You know, the difference between a Torghast run where you get your best power on the first offering versus one where you never see it until the 5th floor is night and day, right? That can make the run take twice as long. And obviously, in a Mythic Plus dungeon, something taking twice as long is a Depleto often. But it doesn't look like that's going to be the case here. There may still be some elements of, like, things being different week to week. That's something we don't know about yet. But for the most part, it does appear to not be based on RNG at all and appears to be fully predictable. And then finally, for every lieutenant still up when the final boss is pulled, it will apply an aura that will make the final boss harder. So unlike Awakened, where the lieutenants themselves showed up, on the last boss, you will get just the aura that the lieutenant has when you deal with it. So let's go through and talk about what the 4 lieutenants are. Unlike Awakened, they're actually present in the dungeon, although they don't currently do any sort of proximity-based... Like, they don't have any social aggro components to them. So if you pull other mobs through them, or if you pull them through other mobs, it doesn't appear that they are going to be aggroing anything that way. So that might be a nice little way that it's not going to be too hostile. I don't know all of the true sight or not, or skippable or not implications of them either. That might be somewhat relevant, but my guess is you'll probably generally kill most of them to get the Anima Powers and to not have to deal with the aura on the last boss. And they are listed on both your map and on your mini-map. So here is a Mist of Tyrna Scythe, for instance, and here you can see the 2 lieutenants that are currently spawned, and presumably the other 2 spawn, once you open the gates to the maze, right? That kind of stuff. Okay, so actually, here's the info about True Sight. They don't reset health on wipe, so that's very similar to Prideful, right? They'll stay on 40% health if you wipe to them. I love this mechanic when it's applied to these sorts of mobs because it makes it a lot less punishing to wipe, and I think that wipes are inherently punishing enough, so it is good when mechanics do not kick you when you're down and don't make it so that dungeons are this very binary of experience of as soon as you wipe, it's over, and this helps with that. They do have True Sight, and they do not give count, which the giving count thing, that's something that I know in particular people have complained about that with different affixes, whether or not they give count. But in the past, sometimes they've just given these things like small, meaningless amounts of count anyway. And I actually don't mind them not giving count as long as they are well balanced, such that there is still an incentive to kill them. I think one problem that these things have sometimes is that if they make them skippable, easily skippable, with no punishment for doing that, and they don't give count, then you're put in this really awkward position where like the clearly best play is to skip them, and it just becomes a metagame all built around that. But I don't foresee that being an issue because there's so much incentive, both a carrot and a stick, for killing these things. Okay, so they have an aura that will apply to the entire party while the lieutenant is engaged before the final boss, or if you pull the final boss while they're still alive, you will get the aura on the final boss as well. So presumably this means you can't be like finishing off a lieutenant and pull the final boss, because then it will get the aura even once you kill the lieutenant. It probably won't go away, although that is something worth testing. But here are those auras. A 50% move speed reduction, which if you're thinking about doing a lot of end bosses with this, there's a lot that would be pretty nasty, although there are probably some you could get away with this with a move speed reduction on. A dot, a healing reduction, increased physical damage taken, and so then each of these auras are also, one is applied to each lieutenant. So let's go through those lieutenants. First off, we have the Incinerator. The Incinerator's aura is Soulforge Flames, right? So Torghast themed. That's one of the Torghast torments as well, right? And it's just fire damage every 3 seconds. And 2 abilities. Scorching Blast, which is this, you see this void zone, that a swirly that gets cast and then turns into a fire void zone. And Melt Soul, which is currently 100% increased physical or fire damage taken on a target, but is dispellable. So I guess should be dispelled, probably, but or just don't stand in any fire. But I don't know about your groups, that doesn't always work out in mine. Okay, so pretty straightforward boss. However, depending on the scaling on this fire damage over time, might be possible to do this aura with the last boss, but I doubt that this is going to become super... There's going to be super lots of pressure on skipping lieutenants and going to final bosses, because then you're giving up on the Anima Powers that they'll drop after they die as well, which we'll get to after we finish going through all of these lieutenants. Next one is Cold Heart, another Torghast Wing. Chilling Presence is a 50% move speed slow, which is actually can be kind of nasty with the abilities that this one has, which is, so there's Biting Cold, which is a dot that is also dealt to any players that are near you. So you can see there's a player with that Biting Cold, right? A dot surrounding them. And Frostlance, which is, it's more, you remember the Jaina? I mean, it's basically the exact same thing as the Jaina mechanic, where it's a nice frontal, same image as that. So you need to move out of that, but obviously you're slowed, so that does throw a bit of a wrinkle into that. It is currently a 2 or 3.5 second cast time, though, so you probably have time to get out of that, unless you're really not paying attention, or unless you're fighting it with trash, which is something that we should discuss later, because actually I don't really have too much of an idea of how fightable these things will be with trash, but I feel like this one and this one both, there's no reason you couldn't do this with a medium difficulty pull. So I think that might be something that we do see out of these. Then there's Sagadon the Breaker, which causes players to take 50% increased physical damage. Other abilities include Massive Smash and Lumbering Might. So Massive Smash is a physical damage AoE to people within 16 yards and a knockback, but it's a 3.5 second cast, 16 yards away, right? So you can get out of that within the 3.5 seconds. And then Lumbering Might, which is a move speed slow that increases their damage. So the idea here is to kite it for the duration of that. Again, you're taking increased physical damage, so getting hit by Massive Smash, getting hit even by regular autos, but especially by Lumbering Might autos, is going to be deadly here. But you almost certainly do not want the last boss of the dungeon to be dealing 50% increased damage to your tank, so I'm pretty sure you're going to want to take this one off the board. And then Executioner Varuth, who has Thanatophobia. Players receive 50% less healing, which is that's a nasty one. And then these two abilities, which a guildie of mine pointed out that these are pretty well positioned for paladins to deal with. One is a high physical damage to the tank and a short bleed effect, and the other one is high physical damage to a target and nearby targets within 5 yards. So this is kind of similar to that one from Theater of Pain, right, where you get the red swirly or a red circle on somebody, and then the mini boss charges them and bleeds them and their nearby friends, and it's a short bleed effect on all of them. So again, bleed removes, valuable against this. That's Kyrians can do that. Kyrian tanks. Already, a lot of tanks have incentive to play Kyrian, but having a Kyrian file for this will be very nice. because again, you're going to have this dot, and also you're going to be receiving less healing. And paladins, particularly like the ability to bop somebody who's being targeted by rays, such that they don't take the physical damage and they don't have the bleed, is going to be nice too. So that is definitely something to think about. This one is probably the only one that is looking super hard, and also one that has these kind of counterplays from covenants and from, specs and stuff. So watch out for this one. And this is one that I'm kind of thinking is going to be one that people will use cooldowns on, or maybe they will fight by itself. Whereas these are ones that I think maybe don't require cooldowns, or maybe you use cooldowns and pull them with trash for the other three. Okay. Anima Powers. This is the part that has been the most controversial, but I think that the way that they've handled this is actually pretty cool. So when you defeat a lieutenant, your entire party gets to choose an Anima Power for the rest of the run. The Anima Powers are role dependent, so tanks won't get the mana restoration ones. And they are not RNG. Players are getting the same Anima Powers from the same lieutenant based on their role. It also appears that they are getting the same Anima Powers across dungeons right now, although I haven't got that 100% confirmed, but that's what it looks like right now. The open question here is whether this is based on a weekly change, or whether this changes not at all, or whether it's on sort of a tied to the Torghast wings that are open type thing, which I've seen some speculation because of how this is all tied to Torghast with the different effects. My guess is that it will be that they're coded to the week, right? So the Affix week, in the same way that... So I think, like, weeks 1 through 12 might each have their own set of these Anima Powers, where, Incinerator, Arcaloth, for a given role, will offer the same 3 Anima Powers in every dungeon for the whole week. I think that is the way that I'm most hopeful that they will go. There are a couple other ways they could do it. It could, of course, vary per dungeon also. But I think it would be nice for it not to, just to reduce the amount of learning that you have to do, and to make it possible to, like, get an idea of what your powers will be in each dungeon without having to consult an outside resource every time. I already suspect that it will be valuable before you doing at least your first key of the week to consult an outside resource. Maybe even MDT will have this included, where you can, like, mouse over them and it'll show you what your Anima Powers per role that will be offered are. But I think it's nice that it's not being done randomly, because I think that randomness has these problems for the high-level keys, and that's nice that they're avoiding that. And I think it should still be pretty exciting, especially, if you're somebody who doesn't do keys that much. It might not even feel like they're super scripted or whatever if they change every week, right? And you'll do a couple keys each week. You'll still get a nice bit of variety. And depending on which dungeon you're in, you might make some different choices. So let's go take a look at what some of the Anima Powers are. First off, there's been the data mining of the ones that are related to M+ affixes. It's unclear whether these will be showing up on the weeks of their respective affixes, but for the most part, several of these actually have been tuned to be quite good so far. Stuff like the Volcanic Plumage one has been doing a high percentage of people's damage from the damage meters I've seen so far. The Necrotic Wounding Dagger, you get to necrotic enemies, which, so you put a dot on them. The Bolstering Signet, an interesting one here. To me, this is kind of the devs mocking us, because enemies that die within 40 yards bolster you, increasing your damage done by 4% for 20 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. Successive stacks do not increase duration. I have been lobbying for this, for a timer, and then this text to be added to Bolstering, and to Necrotic, actually, just forever. So it's funny that it's showing up when it's going to apply to us, of course, but there's no indication that will come for the mobs version of Bolstering either. Although it's not too late, Blizzard, to add that nerf into Bolstering for this patch cycle. This is the kind of thing that I actually think, depending on how it's coded, one thing about the way that Bolstering works on live right now is that there are some mobs that are hard coded to not bolster, including most mobs that are, like, summoned during a boss encounter. But if this doesn't follow those same restrictions, right, this could actually be a pretty good Anima Power for certain bosses, right? Imagine Echelon, where when he smashes those 6 imps, and imagine if you then instantly got a 20-second, 20% damage increase, right? That would be pretty cool. And good for that boss. Other boss fights do have adds dying during them. that would be the most useful thing, I think, for Signet to bolstering. Otherwise, in general, I think this will probably end up averaging out to a pretty small amount of damage relative to the amount of damage that I've seen coming out of the procs. Then you got the Sanguine one that is basically, it's trying to mimic the like small AoE of Sanguine, this I think is going to be a healer specific one. So your healing spells and abilities have a chance to heal allies for 6 and inflict, this is a placeholder number, but heal allies and inflict damage to up to 5 enemies within 12 yards, right? So short range AoE, kind of like Sanguine. And then Raging Battle Axe here. Your damaging spells and abilities against enemies below 30% health cause them to suffer 2%. I assume 2% more damage from you, stacking up to 10 times. And whenever you see 4 until canceled, this is always just something that they'll clean up later in tooltips. So you can just usually delete this in your mind until you see it. So that's 20. That means that you'd stack up to a 20% damage increase against enemies below 30% health. Could be pretty strong. Could be the kind of thing that is effective. I mean, especially this is the only one I've seen so far that like would be good on the week of that affix, right? You'd like an execute effect against Raging week. So the other ones don't really seem like you'd particularly care about having them on the week of that affix, but Raging Battle Axe does seem like a good anima power, especially on Raging week. Then a bunch of these other ones here. Magic damage taken reduced by 15%. Potentially could be an important part of the puzzle for high keys. I'm curious if this is one that shows up for all roles or if this is one that doesn't, because this would be a pretty good one for certain tanks in certain dungeons as well. Champion's Brand here. While above 70% health, your haste or crit is increased, and your highest stat of those two is always chosen. Again, this one's actually probably pretty good. You're often above that health threshold. And so, yeah, I expect this one will again be quite competitive, although so far from what I've seen, the proc-based ones have looked like they're pretty well-tuned, so maybe these stat-based ones will have a hard time competing. This one, especially for tanks, I love the sound of this. Your verse is increased by 3%. Okay, whatever, boring. Upon entering combat, your damage taken is reduced by 40% for 3 seconds. This is the kind of thing that for a lot of tank specs, the start of the pull, think about stuff like Prot Paladin, Guardian Druid, Blood Death Knight. You have these globals at the start of the pull where you're like, Mirror Rend, okay, I'm trying to grab threat on everything so I don't have my defenses all up. And those are actually times where you're pretty liable to die. So this could be very strong for those tank specs, if this is a power that tanks can see. Gain Leech while your health is below 25%. I doubt this one will be super competitive with the other options that it appears next to. But maybe, I guess in theory, against like dots, you're going to be pretty hard to kill below 25% health. Well, I think in Mythic Plus, often you go from, above 25% to 0 pretty often. So just having the floor set there at 25%, 25% is not a safe health to be at. So it's not safe for this thing to turn off above there. So I'm less excited about this one. You take 5% less damage from area of effect attacks. Potentially something that helps move some abilities out of the one-shot range. I don't think you'll really use this as just a throughput, tankiness increase on your character, but if this is something that moves things away from being one-shotty, or if there's dungeons where AoE effects are really scary on certain boss fights, this is the kind of thing that you might want to take, like Hakar, Mordretha. Those sorts of fights are ones where there's a lot of kind of unavoidable but coded as AoE damage. So pretty good there. I mean, for the same reasons that people like Avoidance in Mythic Plus when they can get their hands on it. Gavel of Judgment. Your auto attacks stun the target for 4 seconds, once every 30 seconds. This is kind of cool. This is the kind of power that, again, I like this because its value will be dependent on your group. If your group is full of AoE stuns, they will actually hate that you're DRing their stuns and making the AoE crowd control effects unpredictable. But for a group without anybody using the stun DR, this is really powerful, right? I mean, even just randomly, even if it's done to random mobs, stunning them for 4 seconds is a huge reduction in the amount of either cast or autos they'll do on your tank, right? When you attack a new creature, they're silenced for 3 seconds. This is a great way to group casters. So in dungeons where there's that going on, this is something to definitely consider picking up on somebody. Your healing spells have a chance to generate loose mana, which can be collected to restore 10% of your maximum mana. Oh, this is actually another affix related one as well. It's the old overflowing affix, maybe. And, I mean, 10% of your maximum mana is a lot, especially considering that we are moving to a world without the Prideful mana buff. Mana is definitely something that I think healers will likely be planning to add 1 mana Anima Power to their kit, probably from the earlier parts of the dungeon. So if this is an option from one of the earlier lieutenants, getting access to it for the whole dungeon will be a really good way to reduce the need to sit and drink. Above 90% health, healing done increased by 15%. Upon death, grant allies 99% reduced damage taken for 5 seconds. This effect can occur once every 5 minutes. This is actually kind of really powerful, but not something that you would use really in a predictable fashion. But this is the kind of thing that definitely could help prevent wipes. I mean, imagine if you take this as a tank, right? You take this as a tank and just, even though you go down, as long as somebody gets a B-res on you, nobody else is going to die while you're dead, right? And that means that you're going to be able to potentially turn wipes into not wipes, right? You're going to be able to turn wipes into, okay, we lost a B-res, but it's fine. You eat food faster, much faster. This is, again, a secretly really powerful effect. If you remember how much fish feasts were the defining, food of Mythic Plus for the key pushing groups in the seasons where they worked in Mythic Plus, this basically turns all of your food into fish feasts. And so I think this kind of fits into that overflowing chalice. Healers will look for one of this sort of effect to get them through the dungeon on their mana front, unless they're feeling really confident or they're playing a spec where mana is not an issue. Restore 6% of your max HP every 3 seconds while standing still. So this is 2% of your health in HPS, assuming you stand still. There's some synergies here with some Soulbind traits, like in the General Draven tree as well, that want you to stand still. But, it's Venthyr, not many tanks are Venthyr. In general, Mythic Plus, you don't really stand still that much, even on bosses. Like, you can a little bit. Casters do stand still, but for casters, 6% of your max HP is less than it is for, say, tanks, who are more interested in self-HPS type effects. So this one, again, this was a Legion Legendary power that had some uses, but I think that it's less HPS here than that one had, and it'll be very. You will need a reason to pick this power. Let's say, inflicts 10% increased damage to targets you successfully interrupt for 5 seconds. I wonder if this works on AoE stuns if that interrupts enemies. My guess is it won't. My guess is you'll have to actually do kick, wind shear, a single target interrupt effect. In order to gain the benefit of the effect here, which still pretty cool, pretty compelling. 5 seconds though of 10% increased damage. From what I've seen, this is likely to be less strong than the procs so far. You grant all allies within 20 yards an additional 30% movement speed. Actually, kind of sweet. This is the sort of thing that is, again, sleeper OP. Nobody looks at this and is like, oh, I want to pick this over a damage proc, but moving through the dungeon a lot faster saves you a lot of time. Increases all self-healing by 75%. This is one that I'm really curious what roles this shows up for, because if this is something that tanks can pick, I mean, imagine Blood Death Knights with this thing, right? That's completely absurd. My guess is that this doesn't show up for the tank role, but if it does, I'll be picking it every dungeon. Standing still increases your damage dealt by 5% every 1 second, up to 15%. This is the last one you move. Okay, so now we found a standing still thing that might actually incentivize DPS to stand still, right? And to really try and min-max this. I mean, 15% damage that is potentially for a whole boss fight or most of a boss fight. And for mages, right, if you shimmer and you can keep this, which probably you can, this is potentially huge, right? I mean, 15% flat damage increase. That's up the whole time, right? We're not talking, consider how much this is. This is 10% increased damage for 5 seconds when you successfully interrupt, which means not bosses, which means to one mob, not an AoE, and it's based on your cooldown of your interrupt, which is 15 seconds for melee and 24 for ranged, and you need to have something to actually interrupt on a target that you care about damage. So think about all the hoops that you're jumping through on this power for 10% damage, and then this one, standing still is a big hoop, but you don't have all those other hoops, right? It's functioning in AoE, it works on bosses, it doesn't ask too much more of you. I think this will be definitely something that is contributing a worthy amount of damage and probably competitive with the damage proc effects. Standing still stores healing equal to 3% of your current health every 1 second, up to your maximum health. When you move, this energy is expended to heal the most injured player within 40 yards. This one is, I think, a strong reason for... I assume this will only show up for healers, but if this shows up for anybody, I mean, this is the kind of thing where you could imagine just, like, you're standing still on a boss fight for 10 seconds. That means you've stored up healing equal to 30% of your health, right? And then you move, and so you're healing somebody... You're healing the most injured player, which I assume could be you as well, within 40 yards for a third of a health bar. You could do that 6 times per minute, right? If you stand still for 10 seconds, then just tap your movement key. That is a tremendous amount of HPS. So I assume this is only available for healer roles, but if it's available for DPS or particularly for tank roles, I think that that's something that is hugely, hugely powerful. And this is, again, this one is also a standout high power Anima power. The fifth skull. While in combat, if there are 5 or more enemies within 10 yards, the skull releases a wave of shadow, inflicting 5 shadow damage, that's a placeholder number, every 5 seconds, to up to 5 enemies. This is the most emblematic of Shadowlands Anima power that I've ever seen, right? It, like, only functions in AoE on 5 targets, but it also loses effectiveness as soon as you go above 5 targets, right? So this thing is basically saying, 1 to 4 targets, I sleep, 6 or more targets, I'm not any extra help against, 5 targets. That's the number. It's a very Shadowlands effect. Again, all the ones that basically do flat damage so far have looked like they're tuned pretty highly. So as long as you are in a dungeon where 5 pulls are common, 5 or more enemies being pulled are common, I think this will be a strong Anima power. Some dungeons, the average pull size is more like 4. In those dungeons, that'll be a little bit more awkward, right? The Stone Ward shields you for 20% of your max HP. This absorb refreshes every 30 seconds. Hugely powerful effect against one-shots for DPS players. Like if you're pushing a keystone to the level where there are boss abilities that potentially can one-shot you, right? If you're trying to live through huge bursts of damage like that, this is the sort of thing where being overshielded is really valuable. Even against stuff like the frontals in Halls of Atonement, you know, that key level exists and people play at it a lot, where it barely kills you if you get hit by one of those things, right? And so a shield like this, I mean, this is much less HPS if you just looked at it compared to this, right? This is gonna effectively heal 40% of your max HP every minute, and this one heals, what is 3 times 60? Hang on, I have an app for that. 3 times 60, 180%, right? So this thing represents like 4.5 times the HPS of this, but this one is just like always going to get good value, basically. As long as you are ever basically going to take any damage, this is going to be evaluated and effective healing. So that this is a very strong type of healing. However, relatively low number, it may be worse than the other options that it's next to. It's not something that, like, I mean, this one just yells at me that it is doing so much HPS that you will jump through the hoop to get that HPS. And then we have the Stygian King's Barbs. When enemies strike you in melee combat, shadow barbs lash out from you and inflict 7% of your current health and shadow damage to them. This one is another one of those proc ones, 7% of current health and shadow damage. I mean, this is so much damage that the damage meters. I've seen some damage meters. Let me say, I've seen some damage meters. I don't think this Anima power is going to make it to live in this number, right? 7% of your current health when enemies strike you in melee combat for tank specs that are potentially at like 100k health. That means that you're dealing 7k back to mobs that auto you. Like if a mob is just autoing you once every second, right? This thing is dealing 7k DPS to them. I don't know if it has an ICD or something, but from the damage meters I've seen so far, yeah, it's just it is looking completely crazy. So I wouldn't worry too much about this one, but if it does go live, I think tanks will be clicking on it, yeah. And then whenever you take more than 25% of your max HP in damage from a single attack, you gain 50% increased movement speed and suffer 50% less damage for 3 seconds. So this is actually going to be really good as long as the keystone level is high enough that incoming damage is at this level, right? 25% of your health in a single attack. Whenever that is the case, this is a strong proc, right? This is a great way to get you out of danger, and the 50% less damage makes it a lot less likely you will get, say, 2-shot. Obviously, that doesn't help against one-shots, but it oftentimes in Mythic Plus, things feel like one-shots when in practice what actually happened is within a 0.5 second window, you took 3 hits for a third of your health. And against that, this is extremely powerful, right? This is the kind of thing where actually you will then take only 2/3 of your health in damage, so you'll still have 33% health, and for the next 2.5 seconds, you'll be taking 50% less damage, so effectively you still have a bunch more health than that. And you get a buff, a huge movement speed buff to let you get out of danger. So again, a cool little effect, but it is kind of niche, and I think that right now, the way it's looking from what I've seen, from the damage meters I've seen, taking stuff like Volcanic Plumage, taking stuff like, that sort of effect is the best thing you can be doing when it is offered to you. We'll have to see exactly how this balancing changes. I suspect that they will be doing some juggling with the numbers here, but because of the way that it's not RNG dependent, right? Because of the way that you can probably go into some resource, maybe Wowhead will have them per week, maybe MDT will have them, maybe Raider.io will have them, where you can just see like what the Anima Powers available will be in any given dungeon for any given role for any given week. Those are the things that they might change based on, or it might even not be all of those things, right? They might even be fixed for some of those different variables, but it looks like it's going to be predictable what you're going to get, which means that it's not that big a deal if some are way better than others. It might create a problem. Okay, so imagine if they are based on per week, and then just like the weeks where Volcanic Plumage is available are the push weeks, and the weeks where it's not aren't the push weeks, depending on if this one continues to do way more damage than other options, right? If that's the sort of thing that's going on, then we might have a problem. But it's at least a little bit less bad that there are some underwhelming ones, right? Because you're not going to have this possibility of getting unlucky and seeing 3 bad Anima Powers that don't, like that. If that happens, it's fully predictable. It's happening to everybody else in that role that week in that dungeon, right? And maybe even not based on the dungeon. It might just be based on per role, per lieutenant, per week. We'll have to do some more testing to figure out exactly what the variables are that affect the Anima Powers you see. But again, right now it doesn't appear that a roll of the die is part of that. So love the sound of that. Anyways, this video's gone on a little bit longer than I thought it would, but there's a lot to talk about here. There's a lot of analysis to do. End of the day, I think that this Anima Power is looking sweet. I think that Awakened was a great affix, and this is leaning further into rewarding you for engaging with the affix, right? You may actually, this might be the first seasonal affix where adding it to a keystone speeds up the dungeon run rather than slowing it down, right? Getting some kind of Anima Power that's worth 10% more DPS is actually probably worth spending a minute killing a lieutenant to do. Whereas the skips from Awakened were like, they were nice. It was nice to get a little bit of a reward, but you would skip those things if you could, right? If you weren't going to get punished on the last boss by having lieutenant spawn, you would skip them. Here is a case of like, maybe even if they didn't have this clause, you'd still be killing lieutenants. And so this might be the first ever really positive affix in the sense of like, it's an affix that makes the dungeon like that playing it well rewards you, right? And it's better than it not being on the dungeon. So I'm delighted to see that. I think Awakened was the best affix they've ever done. And so going back, making a lot of callbacks to it and reusing that formula is great by me. I think that they've really done a good job of looking at the RNG element and coming up with potentially a great solution here. Again, we'll have to see exactly how it works out. It is important that there isn't a couple of overpowered ones that warp the whole experience, but that's the sort of thing that's actually pretty easy to balance, making sure that the overpowered ones are cut down to a reasonable level, and removing the RNG component means that it's a lot less important if there are small fluctuations between the good ones and the medium ones, right? Like that sort of thing becomes a lot less important if you're not actually randoming them each dungeon run. So there's my take on the Anima Powers. Hope you like this video. Again, check out the links in the description if you want to read all this for yourself. The Wowhead article there. And come check out my Twitch stream. Hit subscribe, hit follow, hit like on my Twitter page, PayPal me some money, do all that stuff. Don't do that. That's fine. Just sub to my Twitch if you've got some extra money lying around. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.